today we want to talk about kind of unleashing the potential for team capacity planning and allocation policies. And that's really the kicker. So I think that for a lot of teams, that's new, right? So what they tend to do is teams get together, and I've got some slides here. I don't have a lot of slides. We're really hoping that this turns into a Q&A and some real good sharing. And I want to share and layer in some stories from teams I've worked with, things I've observed, that type of thing. So hopefully it'll be a little less focused on the actual slides. But just want to set the scene. If you're not familiar with capacity planning, I think this is a hot topic. I know it is because I've seen a lot of people signing up for this, right? We've got a lot of folks on the call, a lot of people interested in this. A lot of teams out there struggle with this. And they do it, but they don't fully, in my experience anyway, don't fully commit to it, right? And it takes a few things, right? And you have to build some trust within the team, right? And I'll explain why that's a big factor, underlying factor in making this work and work well. You have to create the psychological safety for this to happen, because this is a level of transparency that sometimes can be uncomfortable for teams. So you have to kind of lay that groundwork, and it's a foundation upon which real capacity planning can take place, right? You got to foster that type of an environment. So what is capacity planning? Just a real quick definition here, and just FYI, I'm going to share this deck afterwards, so you can have this for your own benefit, maybe work with your teams and your organizations. But it's really to align, right? Scale, think about a scale and balancing your team's availability with the work demands, right? And we'll talk about this concept of velocity, probably something that everyone's familiar with, but capacity and velocity and how you balance those two things, right? And the key, right, we know from our Agile experiences that we're trying to get teams at a sustainable pace, right? So sustainable, predictable delivery, right? That's highly valued within the Agile space. So we don't want folks sprinting to exhaustion, right? We want marathon teams, marathon runners, things that folks who can get a pace and stay with it for a long period of time, right? Fundamental balance goal, is around balancing the team's capabilities with the product and the application. So think about it from if you're aligned to a product, right? You've got the product's needs, and you also have the capabilities of the team. You want to balance those things out, right? Key considerations. I won't go through every single one of these, but just suffice it to say that in order for you to find that balance, right, strike that balance, and why you're doing this, why you're doing capacity planning, is that all of these things need to be transparent in order for this to be successful. So when we think about balancing the work items, right, and capacity, we need to make sure that we're accounting for everything, right? And again, that's where I kind of referred to this idea of making sure that you're creating the psychological safety and for this level of transparency, because we really want to know, right, what everybody's working on. And we all know from working with teams, you always have one or two what I call, quote, heroes, right, who are working on items that maybe aren't represented on the Kanban board for the team, right? Whether it's a production fix, doing some research, you need to account in order to weigh those balances out, right? The scales of what your capacity is and all the work items. So you have to, again, have everything represented on the Kanban board from a work perspective, right? All the stories that they might be working on, any research that you're doing, production fixes. It could be, tech debt type work, really everything, right? If they're out for a day, if they're out for a half a day, if they're out because they're not 100% allocated, right, to that team, maybe they are in general, but on that particular iteration, they are on loan to somebody else, or they're helping another team, right? You need to have that represented. Now, again, sometimes folks feel there's a feeling of micromanagement. That is not, right? That is not the intent. That is not the purpose here. What we're trying to do is to be able to give the team all the information that they need to be able to self-manage themselves in their work. And you can't do that, right, if all the work is not there, right, or being represented on the Kanban board from a work effort perspective, or if you're not really truly accounting for the capacity, right? So you can't balance those scales, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So if you can strike that balance, right? You're going to find some of these desired outcomes around utilization, not overburdening teams, but finding that optimal, right, utilization for the team and for the individuals. And some of the expected benefits, right? You do see better morale, right, in the teams who are grappling with this, right, and finding themselves maybe overburdened, right? And someone mentioned they struggle with this idea of capacity allocations, right, and having a policy. I think it's important to understand, and the team to understand what a capacity allocation policy is, and not just go through the capacity planning process where they say, everyone gets together before the sprint or iteration, says, I'm going to be out for vacation. Okay, well, we're going to take some points off. And then we've done capacity planning. There's much more to it than that, right? So again, hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that and people can share some stories. All right. So key things to think about with capacity planning, you need to account for everything. Okay, need to account for everything on both sides of that scale in order for it to balance out correctly, and for your team to be able to learn and manage and self-manage themselves. So velocity is a key component of this, right? So when we start to talk about what is our capacity as a team, you need to understand how that balances with velocity. So just real quick, how we define velocity is important. So is a reference slide. This may be familiar for folks. But if not, this is a great reference for you. Velocity, the concept of velocity, if you're using story points as a team, is to find an average, right? An average of what your team, right, historically has been able to do, because that historical data is a good measure for you to plan your work going into the future. So as you look forward to the next iteration, right? A 2-week period, let's call it, right? Because that's the most typical, let's plan out our capacity, who's going to be available. And we can bump that up against our velocity, start adding story points, right? Doing the math, that part's not hard for teams to conceptualize and to go through, but hopefully, and when you leave today, you'll have something to go back to see how you can go next level on this, okay? But I want to go over the basics first. So you're trying to balance.
Hey, Todd, a couple questions.
Okay.
We're popping in here pretty good. I love it.
Great.
So first off, you mentioned technical debt, which might apply to code, right? From a bigger picture, Robert asks, would you consider document debt to be a thing, or is minimizing documentation a legitimate goal?
I would factor that in, right? Because typically when I work with teams, I work with teams to determine what it is they need from working in terms of a working agreements perspective. And one of those things usually is around this idea of a quality plan, like what is our quality, what's going to be required for our changes. And some of that might be certain levels of documentation. So if they are not living up to their quality standards, whether it's technical debt or documentation debt, I would put that in the same category in terms of, we want to make sure that as they're doing the work, they're accounting for that work, right? So they don't have to go back later and do some technical cleanup or go back later and update documentation, right? Want to bake that in. That makes sense.
All right, 2 more questions.
Yeah.
First off, a question was asked, what's the difference between WIP limits and capacity allocations?
So WIP limits, they both relate to flow to a certain extent, right, for teams. And so we could dive into that a little bit deeper, but let's suffice it to say WIP limits are usually the number of work items on the board at any given point in time, or within a particular column on a Kanban board, right, in order to increase flow. The flow accelerator is to limit the amount of work in progress in order for the team to start focusing on completing or getting things done versus starting new things. So that's the basic concept of WIP limits.
All right, last question. These are great questions, by the way.
Yeah.
How do you find the velocity when you're on Kanban and don't use story points?
Yeah, there are. I don't cover it here, so unfortunately, but there are methods to, if you're not doing story points, to try and come up with what your team's, what would be the equivalent of a velocity, right, from a story point number. So there's some tips and techniques maybe I could share it. If there's a place I could share some of those afterwards, David, I'd be glad to do that.
Yeah, we send an email out with the PDU code and the slides. So if you wanted to give us that, you want to send that to Laura Hill before we send that out, that'd be great.
Yep, I'll add that in.
Keep rocking.
Yeah, so from a velocity standpoint, pretty straightforward. Most tools, if you're using things like Jira or Rally, you're going to find that it calculates it for you, but it's really a rolling average, the last 5 sprints, right? What's the average number of story points if you're using story points, right? And most teams do. What's the average story point? All right, that could be your target. If you have a newly formed team, right here on the slide, you can see just an example of how you could come up with a velocity moving forward. Again, trying to balance that scale. If you don't have one already, if you're a brand new team, or you had a significant change in your team potentially, right? So assuming you see the example, don't have to walk through it completely, but assuming you have a 7-person team, you would exclude the Scrum Master and the product owner, right? Because they're not actively hands on the keyboards, coding, testing, in most teams. So you want to exclude them. And then just you do 8 points per sprint. This is based on, or iteration, this is based on a 2-week iteration or sprint. You're going to deduct a couple of points for other meetings, other commitments. You get down to 8 points times 5, you get 40. Okay, so that would be what you might be able to start out with if you had a brand new team in terms of velocity. Again, adding those 40 points to one side of the scale, then trying to figure out your capacity on the other side of the scale. So hopefully that makes some sense. One important thing that I always want to stress with my teams and product owners, and especially stakeholders, is this is an average, right? So when you're talking about expectations with product owners and stakeholders, especially, you want to make sure that you're very clear about that. So this is the average, right? So what that means is half the time the team over 5 sprints, this is what they average. So the team could be under that number, right? That story point number. They could be above that story point number. This is where it's kind of averaged out. So it's 50% of the time they were probably under that, right? So it's good to set that expectation with stakeholders and for them to understand what that velocity really means. Because too often I'll have conversation with them and the expectation is 100% they're going to hit that number, right? That's not true. If you want to increase the confidence level that they're going to hit that 40-point story point number, you would want to shoot under that, right? Because that's only the average. So if you go below, if you want more than 50%, you want an 80% certainty that they're going to hit that mark, you probably want to lower the number. Hopefully that resonates. But I think that's important because too often, it's important to stress because too often folks see that and they say, there's a 100% chance, 100% confidence they're going to hit that, right? That's not true. Okay.
Got another question.
Great.
How does QA fit into the velocity?
So that's a great question as well, because very often, right, you work with teams that potentially they bake in a certain amount of their work. Say, let's say from a testing or QA perspective, maybe it's only one up, one down type testing, or it's just unit testing, and then it has to go on to quote UAT testing in another environment, right? A lot of organizations are still stuck with these legacy applications, this mindset of moving things through test environments. So that's a separate topic as well, right? And it's a separate thing that folks struggle with, but they should be, as a team, defining that, again, potentially through a working agreement, but basically around their definition of done, what level of testing, right? Ideally, right, in theory, the team would be testing everything fully so that when they're done with it, it is ready to move to production, right? And that's what should be baked into their estimates when they're doing their story point estimates. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. So why is capacity planning, right, so critical? Some bullet points here, right? I talked about the need to be predictable, the impact it has on the team, the stakeholder trust that it builds, right? Some of these aspects. But it's really, really important to avoid that, that burnout that happens, right? And that's definitely what happens if you don't plan well from a capacity standpoint, right? If you're continuously overburdening your team, right, by not planning well, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit too, because it talks about continuous improvement, right? The last bullet. You need to revisit this in retrospective with your teams. How did we do in terms of our capacity planning, right? Often what you'll have is teams will, and we'll get to this when we talk in the next slide, when we start to talk about capacity allocations, but teams will say, well, we're a DevOps team, so we're supporting, not only are we developing the features, right? We are supporting our application. So we're doing P fixes, right? We're doing production fixes. We've got bugs. We're going to set aside story points, 5 story points. It's just a block, a generic block, right? To represent it on our board. If you don't go back at the end of every iteration and say, did we really do 5 points worth of effort? Or did we do 8? Or did we do 3, right? If you're not doing that, and you're doing a disservice to the team, right? Because the team could be doing much more than 5 or 3 points, whatever they're putting up there, right? Don't just, it's too easy to get into that, put a block up there, right? So we'll talk about that when we talk about capacity allocations. But
all right, got 2 more questions. Man, they're fired at you, Todd. This is awesome. This is what we want. All right, so one question is, so should teams first define what is their definition of done before attempting capacity planning?
Yeah, so as teams, I always advocate. I don't think I've ever worked with a team that didn't have at least 2 working agreements. One being a definition of ready, and the other being a definition of done. So right from the get-go, the team should have a definition of ready and definition of done that they continuously kind of improve and revise, but they should have one of those 2 working agreements. And I never did this before, right? When I was a Scrum Master and or an early Agile coach, but I do it now. We talk about capacity planning, and we go and have the conversation around an allocation, right? A capacity allocation policy, either as a team or a team of teams, right? If I'm talking to let's say a train or whatever you want to call them, right? An organized team of teams, because it's important for them to understand, like, how would we want it to be, right? What would we like to see, right? Do we think, based on our product that we're supporting, if you're aligned as a product, or based on our application suite, what portion of our allocation, what portion of our time should we be developing new features? What portion of our time should we be doing production fixes to support, right? And what should we allocate for things like technical debt? So you have to have, you have to have a goal. Like so here's here's an analogy. So if everybody wants to become, if you want to become more fit and you go to see a coach, a nutritionist, an exercise coach, a trainer, and they say, okay, what's your plan? What do you envision for yourself? Like, okay, I want to lose 15 pounds, right? Okay, so how are you going to do that? Well, I need to do this. I'm going to plan that I'm going to spend this amount of time exercising. I'm going to, my diet's going to change. And quite often you go to any program, what are they going to tell you? Write down everything you eat. Okay, that's easy to say, but then you go to meet with your nutritionist and you've forgotten all about, oh yeah, I forgot to write down the ice cream or the pizza that I had Saturday night, right? Those don't count if I don't write them down. Well, same kind of an idea. It's got to be on the board, right? How are you going to plan? How are you going to learn? How are you going to measure? How are you going to make decisions if you don't kind of lay that all out? And it's a jump. So when I talk with teams, again, I talk about creating that level of trust and psychological safety to be able to do that and be just totally transparent. Look, hey, I didn't reflect this. I spent time working on something outside of the team. Like, it's okay, but let's just account for it. We just need to know.
All right, last question that we have so far. How does a creative team fit into the velocity of a team? A lot of their work is prerequisite for the devs, but their work is also not consistent sprint over sprint.
Say the first part of that again, David.
How does a creative team fit?
Creative team
Into the velocity of a team.
Okay.
A lot of their work is pre-requirements for the devs, but this work is also not consistent sprint over sprint.
Yeah, so maybe that may be challenging, right? Like more challenging, right? I'd have to understand the team a little bit, maybe observe them and understand what they referring to when they say creative team. Maybe I'm thinking more innovation, like are they doing, you know, more yeah, I'm not really sure.
So Diana says, is it a UX team?
Might be a good example. Okay, that's helpful. So yeah, so that, but you would think that you would see trends over time. So yes, that may be challenging, especially at the beginning, but if the team is together, you should see some trends over time to be able to, you know, provide better estimates over time. But there's no question that would be more challenging than the norm.
All right, keep it rocking.
Okay. So key things around capacity planning. Make sure that your teams are representing all of the work on the Kanban board, right? And that the team members' capacity must be accurate and updated every iteration, right? Like, so every iteration, the Scrum Master or a coach should be sitting down. The team should come together before they go into sprint or iteration planning and having a conversation about capacity planning and bumping it up against the allocation policy, right? So that they're not just making some assumptions and saying, oh, it's the same every iteration. Okay.
So a great question that you want to debate here as we keep going forward from Robert is possibly a rhetorical question. As expectations rise about predictability, planning, and following, you put that in caps, following a plan, at some point is the work simply not agile?
It's a good question. Yeah, so that gives me something to think about. I like to think no, because I see the capacity planning and the capacity allocation policy definition is being crafted from the team for the team. I don't see these as mechanisms or tools for someone to manage the team, right? It's for their own self-management. So it's information. Think of it like a retro. Like, so when you go into retro and folks, you know, I always say with our teams, it's Vegas rules, right? What happens in the retro stays in the retro, but you need to open up, be transparent, and just let's get it out on the table. Same is true here. This is really designed when again, creating that trust and psychological safety for teams to really embrace this. This is for you, right? This is for you to help manage your own work and yourselves, right? As a team. This is not about trying to get 100% utilization. In fact, it is the complete opposite of that. We're trying to make sure that you are not at 100% utilization all the time and find yourself in that position. And or find yourself in a position, and now we're moving into this capacity allocation policies space, and you can see some of the content on the slide, but it's about trying to define this so you don't find yourself in this situation where you are a feature factory, where you're spending all of your time and the pressure is get new features out. So you're neglecting quality, right? You're racking up technical debt, or later, right, down the road, you find that your capacity allocation is being totally eaten up by production fixes and technical debt efforts because there's been neglect in the past, right? So balancing that is really the intent, and having this kind of transparent conversation with your stakeholders too, to say, look, we have a capacity allocation policy for a reason, right? We're here to support this product, right, for the long run. We're here to support these applications for the long run, not just for this next release, right? So there are investments that we need to make from an architectural runway standpoint. There's technical debt that we may have to kind of, whether it's documentation, just being open and transparent with them, say, look, we have been under the gun getting features out, right, in our first 2 MVPs. We need, right, time to spend on reducing some technical debt and some production fixes. Not an entire sprint, but we need to increase the percentage, right, of the story points for a couple of sprints to make sure that we're solid, we're in a good place. The worst thing, right, from a stakeholder's perspective is for them to come in and they have instability in their environment, right? You never want to get yourself in that position, right? You never want to be unhealthy. This is about trying to strike a healthy balance between what the team is working on. So,
it's so interesting that you did that. I mean, it's a tough question, right? But if it's the team doing it and someone's not telling them to do it, that's agile. And as long as you're working iteratively, that's agile. Right. Now, two great comments on this. I mean, Cheryl talks about prevents teams from having to work more than 40 hours a week, like you're talking about. You did, and Robert talks about pacing boundaries exists for a reason, and he put amen. So keep it rocking. The great answer. Thank you for that. With a lot of detail there. Good job.
Yeah. So when you think about it, so I've worked with teams, and probably there's some folks out there right now who are working with these teams, but they are in a place where there is so much pressure to get, they're either in one of the two scenarios I just laid out. You could have a team that is, let's say they're newly rolling out a new product and or application. They are under the gun to get new features out, right? So that might be the situation. That might have to happen for an MVP or two, but that's not sustainable, right? Because there is a price to be paid for that down the road. So you have to have these types of conversations. So the pressure might be get features out, forget about, maybe this technical debt that you're racking up. And sometimes that's valid, but it's not sustainable. The opposite situation, I'm sure there's some teams out there right now, they are drowning in what we call the tyranny of the urgent. So they've got production fixes that are just eating up their capacity, right? And it's not, it may or may not be fully transparent to everybody, right? The stakeholders included. So when I've worked with teams in the past, you have to kind of make them understand that especially if they're in that second scenario, we need to be clear about what we want. And again, here on the slide, just an example of a capacity allocation, potentially kind of a split. So feature story 65%, maintenance 25, refactoring 10. That's every team or team of teams might be a bit different, right? So again, if you have a brand new application, a brand new product, you might be looking to get more features out, spending less time on maintenance. If it's later in life, right, from your product perspective. So let's say, and I put a reference up there, product lifecycle and system application lifecycle. It's important you understand where your product is in its lifecycle and where your applications are that you're supporting, where they are in their lifecycle, because those might influence, right, the proportions that you're putting out there, right? If you've got a system that is up and it's clicking away, you've got a product that is pretty established in the market, it's mature, you're probably doing, you don't have the same level of pressure for new features potentially, right? So you can spend more.
So first off, thanks for that answer. But another question is, can you elaborate more on a topic of how to measure and communicate risk? I look at backlog health to measure risk. Do stories exist? Are they well formed and ready? Are they sized? So this is some of the risk questions Andy asked. So can you elaborate more on the topic of how to measure and communicate risk? I look at backlog health to do it, and there were some of the questions. Thoughts?
I couldn't agree more. So backlog health is definitely something that you will want to have conversations with about your team and your stakeholders, your product owner, so they understand what is a healthy backlog. So I would layer in the capacity allocation policy into the backlog as well. So you want to be very clear about the work items. So whether they're a story that is a new feature or related to a new feature, are they production fixes? Are they technical debt type stories? And you want to categorize them as such. You'll see one of the benefit policies up there allows the product owner, policy benefits, allows the product owner and team to prioritize like things against each other. So in other words, you're not comparing and prioritizing production fixes and features, right? The product owner and team, they're prioritizing and preparing within the backlog the feature stories. They also have a separate filter, if you will, right? If you're thinking about it from a Jira perspective or Rally, that says, here are all our production fixes and here are all our technical debt items, right? So you go through and it becomes math, right? It becomes math, and it takes some of it, which is good, because it takes a lot of the subjectivity and passion out of it when you start to have conversations with stakeholders, right? And product owners, depending on, and product managers, to say, we have a policy that we've all agreed on, a working agreement, that we want 65% of our allocation to go to features. We have a velocity right now of 40 points per iteration. That's 26 points, right? So that's the target. We go through the backlog, our healthy backlog. We've got good product backlog health. We've got stories that are prepped to go. We pull them up. Here are our new feature stories. We're looking for 26 points, right? Then we're going to move on to maintenance. 25% is our goal. So roughly, I mean, it's not exactly perfect, right? I mean, there's leeway. The team will work through that. But so roughly 10 points of that 40 should be focused on some production fixes, some maintenance. And then lastly, maybe 4 points worth of refactoring, right? So it's not hard and fast, but it does give you a target, right, as a team. And again, you want to revisit that over time, right? Every iteration, every PI, if you're doing a quarterly, right? You may want to sit down and say, okay, let's look at our capacity allocation policy again. Should we revise that? Should we move the needle a little bit in terms of the portions?
All right, more questions. This is great. Are you considering client request fixes and bugs as feature allocation, maintenance, or refactoring?
Good question. So I would somewhat say it depends. It usually would fall in the maintenance perspective. Like, I think of bugs, you'd have to see them. You'd have to be a conversation with the team and the product owner, right? In terms of what exactly falls in which bucket. If it's a brand new feature, definitely that would fall in the features, right? Refactoring is more typically a little bit more technical in nature. Maybe it's, it could be, there's a few different examples of that, but it could be as simple as some of the documentation that was referenced earlier, right? In terms of in the code, or maybe even some of the testing documentation around unit testing. If it's not all automated and doing it itself, you have to go back in and make sure that that's done. Again, there's trade-offs. Again, often you'll see brand new applications, again, pressures on features. Some of this other stuff slides a little bit. Everybody's been in that position before, but it's not, it has to be acknowledged. Like, you have to call it out, right? So people understand that that's the decision that they're making, right? Okay.
All right, and I think we talked about this a bit, but I think it's interesting to reiterate. For Kanban to have velocity, I assume you have to use Scrum Band framework.
So, okay, great question there, right? Because this is kind of there's some built-in assumptions here that the team is using some story points, right? When I'm talking about velocity in terms of balancing it out. And again, there are other ways, right, for Kanban teams that don't use story points to, I guess, fill up the other side of the scale. And I'll try to share some of those. But yeah, in this instance, you would be capturing story point values.
And Melissa talks about, in the former life, our allocation policies focused around new product innovation, NPI, you guys love acronyms, product line enhancement, PLE, and keeping the lights on, KTLO.
Yeah, I've heard lights on teams many times, worked with them.
Refactoring.
Yeah, these are typical. So these are those great examples. So thank you, Melissa, for sharing that. But yeah, those are good examples, right? And
KTLO. Come on, is that actually real people? I love Melissa. That's the best. Is that
keeping the lights on?
Keep the lights on. That's pretty good. It makes sense, right?
Yep.
You know, the Australian, the New Zealanders call that BAU, business as usual.
Business as usual is another term you hear quite often. Yep.
Yep. I love it. All right, keep going, brother.
Okay. So again, you want to make sure that you put yourself, or you put your product owner and teams in a position where they have like items that they're prioritizing again, right? So because you don't want to, you want to make sure that they're not prioritizing all stories. Not all stories are alike, right? So let's call them out. Let's call them what they are, and categorize them so it's helpful. And then you want to make sure that you're filling up each slice of that capacity allocation. Okay. All right. So here's some bullets for everyone. Again, you can keep these as reference, but so why are capacity allocation policies vital for Agile teams? And there's a number of reasons, right? Again, we talked about this idea of having a balanced prioritization, right? There's lots of upsides to doing that. So we've got maintenance, bug fixes, addressing technical debt. Those are different values, right, that are added. So we want to make sure that we're not comparing, apples and oranges. Right? Predictable delivery, the technical debt. Again, you want to make sure that you're paying down some of that. You're making those investments in the future so that you don't find yourself in a position where you've got a lot of production fixes, a lot of technical debt. And the stakeholders, the business owners, just need to understand that there's a need to do that, right? There's a balanced approach that you're looking for. The team has the best interest of the product and the applications in mind, right? When they're trying to determine these allocation policies. You want to protect the well-being of the team. You want to create some space, right, for things that aren't accountable for. All of these are pretty self-explanatory. You don't have to go through every single one of these. Just seeing if there's any other questions relative to why capacity allocation policies.
No questions at this point.
Are so important, and it's pretty. Again, nothing here is like truly groundbreaking, but for a lot of teams, they don't think about this idea of capacity allocation policy and defining one in terms of a working agreement. I wasn't aware of that as a Scrum Master, right? Capacity planning, I got it. Okay, makes sense. At the team level, I need to do some capacity planning. Who's going to be out, right? What are those big hits? But going a little bit deeper on capacity planning and then understanding how you need to layer in this idea of the allocations, right? And understand your product, how you have to understand your applications and systems that you're supporting and where are they in terms of their life cycle. And having those conversations with stakeholders so that you have the right expectations is tremendously important, right? I'll give you some examples from teams that I've supported in the past, because this is probably the most typical, right? You've got teams that are, there's a set of features, right, that is in the backlog. People want those, obviously, business owners, stakeholders. So there's a lot of pressure to get new features out. But their capacity gets eaten up because they have production fixes, right? And most teams today, a lot of teams are DevOps type teams. So their expectation is that they're doing both. And that's cool. That's okay, right? But the business owners need to understand that they have to balance both of those and why it's important to have a policy to make sure that you have a sustainable delivery model, right? For the health of your applications, the health of your product lines, and over time, right, that you don't find yourself in one of these positions where you become unhealthy and unbalanced. Okay. So some of the common pitfalls. All right, everybody loves these types of slides.
Before you jump into it, good question here. Good question. How can CP balance predictable delivery with QA? Shouldn't we include testing and capacity planning? And why isn't UTA included? Again, I love the acronyms, baby.
Yeah.
So why isn't user acceptance testing included?
Well, ideally it should, right? So teams should, again, and I understand that a lot of organizations aren't there yet, right? A lot of teams maybe aren't in a place where they are able to, at the end of their iteration, have something that's a shippable product, right? That can go to production. Now, I've worked with teams in the past that are cloud-based. Their technology supports, right, the ability to move things to production pretty rapidly. I've also worked with a lot of teams that are confined, I would call it, or limited by some older legacy technology stacks, which require them to move through test environments, levels of test environments before they can get to production. And in those scenarios, right, they have their definition of done may only involve a limited amount of testing, and then it moves on to someone else, right? It moves into a new test environment, and there's a second level of testing before it moves to production. So it's done for them, but not done ready to move to production. So ideally, when you do the estimates, it should bake all of that in, right? That's the theory.
All right, pitfalls. Used to be a great Activision game on my Atari system, by the way. Pitfalls.
It did.
I love that game.
We're dating ourselves, David, but
we are.
I remember Pitfall. So, what do we, this idea of this overcommitment, right? So you're not going to have a sustainable pace. That's a trap you're going to fall into if you don't do capacity planning, if you don't have a good documented set of guidelines, a working agreement around capacity allocations. Ignoring non-feature work, easy to do, right? You get lots of praise. Everyone loves new features. So if you get new features out, people are happy. And but those bug fixes, man, they add up. And then eventually, again, the scale gets tipped, and then you find yourself.
How do you, here's a skinny, how do you articulate technical debt to executives? In a lot of cases, people just don't understand it. I mean, have you found ways that you can do it such they understand the importance of that relative to your capacity planning? Everybody wants the fun stuff.
Yeah.
Any thoughts?
You'll hear the term architectural runway referred to a lot.
That's kind of a big word too.
It is, and people don't really understand it. So I take it. The analogy I use sometimes is I'll bring it home in terms of your house. There's certain things you need to do to your house to make.
That's a good one. That's a really good one. What else? That's
something that's relatable. I'll take the spin on architectural runway and turn it immediately to an analogy of working airport, right? Where there's so much demand to get the flights out. We got to get more flights out. We got to get more flights out. If you don't,
how about a circus, right? You got to constantly clean up after the animals, right? If that's infrastructure. That's dealing with technical debt, right?
Right. And so again, just to finish my runway example though, is if because you talk about architectural runway, if you got potholes in your runway and you have to shut down that runway to get it fixed because you've neglected it over time, you've lost that entire runway. So you've lost it for as much time as it takes. Now you cannot get all that value out on those planes because you've got a runway that's down.
I love those things.
If you can invest in some of those things, your tower, your technology in your tower, if you don't invest in that, you're not going to be able to get these flights out. So there's lots of things to get people to start thinking about in terms of their investments in the future. And
because people assume it just works, it's like nobody changes their oil now because cars are too complex. I mean, with IT and the systems, people just think they're there, and they're always going to be there.
Right.
And so Robert has some good thoughts too in chat, which are kind of cool. Sorry about that, but I thought that was an interesting thing to dig into a bit based on my experience.
And I think the idea of thinking longer term. So Robert, you're spot on in terms of debt. It's like kind of cutting corners, and eventually all those corners add up, right? So, and I think it resonates with executives that I talk to anyway, especially when you start to talk about again in the Agile space. A lot of times I'm working with organizations who they're reorganizing and they're becoming product centric. So then it's about the product and it's about the applications that support that product. So that product has a vision. That product has a roadmap, right? You have to have an equivalent roadmap for all the applications and systems for a long period of time. We're talking 5, 10, 15 years out into the future for that product, right, to be successful and get to that place where it's at mature and it's bringing in the bucks, right, from a business perspective, right? And at that point in time, you have to understand that those systems have to be solid, not just tomorrow you need those features, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, those applications are going to help you bring in all of that revenue, right? They're going to support that product. So it's important to invest in those as well. So, and the best way too is if you can get those executives to spend time with some of these teams. Come to stand up, see what they're doing, see what they're working on. And not only that, have conversations with, like, say, a system architect, so that they can understand their systems. They don't have to be experts in it. They don't have to be IT guys or ladies, right? They don't have to know everything about the systems, but they have to understand the basics of what they are, how they operate, and why they're so important to the success of the product. Okay.
We got about 5 minutes left, or you can go right to questions now, or continue your pitfalls.
There's one more slide, so that in some of the takeaways here.
Good, because you gotta cover every slide now. Come on.
Yeah. Well, I just want to kind of move to that. And again, you're going to have the slides, so you'll be able to walk through all the bullet points. But again, you'll see some trends here, right? Team well-being, essential for balance, effective resource utilization, not trying to find an optimal, right? That's the key word, not full utilization, right? That's not even a goal, right? In fact, that's something that would be a red flag. That would be an anti-pattern if we are looking to try and have 100% utilization, right, for a team. That is not the goal. And the goal, again, is not to micromanage a team. The goal, so these are conversations you have to have, not just with the team, but you have to have these with the stakeholders as well. Look, the team does capacity planning. The team is coming together to talk about what they envision, right, their capacity allocation policy should be, based on their knowledge of the product and based on their knowledge of the systems, right? And again, if there's a team of teams, right, organized, then you could bring them together, right, to have probably a team of teams or a train level allocation policy, although it could be different from team to team slightly, right? So it's important to have an idea of how you believe, what you believe as a team, right? Let's document it. What do we believe? You do that for a definition of ready for your story. You do it for a definition of done for your stories, right? What's the quality level, that we are going to set as an expectation? Let's do that from a capacity standpoint too, right? What do we believe, right, that we should be spending our time on? What are the proportions?
So Robert talks about, I love the concept of balance, keeping levels of idle work backlog and levels of idle workers, aka twiddling my thumbs, at modest levels. I have a buddy who is a very high-end Pardot consultant, and he's got a big project coming up, so they gave him about a week to 2 weeks just to idle, do some break fix things here and there, just to get prepared for what's going to be a very big load of work, and he greatly appreciated it. Yeah. Got a little bored, but he also appreciated it.
But there's a lot of prep that you can do potentially that's going to make, when the wave hits, make that you'll be able to weather the storm quite much
so better. I have one question here, and I have a question. I have another question up here from Inola. I think that's how I pronounce it. I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. How do you think generative AI will affect capacity planning? Do you think you're going to get more? My thought is you're going to get more time. The team's going to have more time to do other things. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, someone referenced this idea of documentation, and there's a lot of progress that's been made outside of generative AI, but to automate testing and capture, like, a lot of document as you go kind of approach, right, to doing work. Yep. Hopefully the documentation is a byproduct of doing the work. That's how I always kind of talk about it with teams. So that it's not extra work, it's just kind of built in. So the extent that you can use AI to do some of that, awesome, right? Anytime saving, right?
Yeah, more thinking time, more test time. And then a question here, can CP and WIP limits change with the products a team is working on, or should CP be static? I like that question.
So by CP, we're talking about capacity planning.
Yeah, sorry, capacity planning and WIP, work in progress, limits change with the products a team is working on, or should capacity planning be static?
I would not recommend it be static. In fact, you see references in the slide all the time, through the content here around capacity planning and the allocations, revisit to make sure that they're valid. So I wouldn't make anything static. And it definitely could change from team to team and based on product and applications, right? So remember when I showed the 65%, right, breakdown, 25%, 10%, that was just an example. It could be quite different for teams, right? Depending on the state of your application, the maturity of your application, your product, you may not be under the gun for a lot of new features, right? So that might be lower for some teams, depending on where you are on that life cycle.
Excellent, Todd. Excellent stuff. So, are you ready for questions?
Yes.
Or do you have anything else brilliant to tell us?
No, more questions. Questions.
All right. Let's hit them. Let's hit them, folks. You can chat them in. That's the best way to get them fast. Questions, comments, thoughts. There's been some great shares from people as well. I greatly appreciated that.
Yeah.
So, Todd, if we can switch, I'll post the conference ad again if you don't mind.
Sure. Let me stop.
I can kick you out because I guess I'm the all-powerful Oz here.
You are. You did it already. You beat me to it. Yeah, I love the whole idea of balance, right? I mean, I'll use the health aspect too, right? Again, you know, I talk about using examples of houses and airports, and I used a quick analogy around, you know, health and fitness. You can neglect, you know, you can not exercise and eat whatever you want, but if, you know, depending on what your goals are, right? But there's a price to be paid in terms of health at some point. So you need to kind of balance all of that stuff. You want a healthy balance in your life, right? At work, personal, you name it, right? Like, so this concept of having a healthy balance, I think folks really resonates with teams when you talk about it that way, and certainly with executives as well. Like, you want a healthy system, you want healthy products, and you want healthy teams.
You know, healthy teams is really critical. I mean, especially in high stress, high change environments from the leadership stuff that we talk about. So Robert says, hilarious quote, I recently heard in a webinar about passion and enthusiasm, everything in moderation. That includes moderation.
Yeah, and there are times, like I mentioned, there are times when you want to go, we're consciously, right, acknowledging and choosing that we want to get a bunch of features out, right? And I think that's so great. I mean, that's such a great comment. And I think with this, you know, change exhaustion is one thing I heard at the Agile Alliance conference at the keynote. Yeah.
You know, people are getting tired. So I'm hoping, and now talking about AI, I hope AI starts cutting back more and more of the busy work, so that can start limiting stress but yet still increase productivity.
It does. It does.
I'm hoping.
It should, right? I think we're seeing lift already with the teams I've been working with, and even personally. Like, I know the partners, you know, that I partner with quite often in the Agile space, they're leaning into AI more and more, and it definitely provides a lift.
All right, you can ask a human to make a baby in 9 months, but don't ask 9 humans to make a baby in 1 month.
Yeah, that doesn't work.
Critical factors for why the adoption of AI is the implementation of ethical AI. You know, Jeremy, there's a big issue, there's a big challenge with that. And the real thing is it starts with us, because what we put in, especially in the open systems, it causes a lot of the issues. And you can actually talk to the AI about what it's doing and whether it's good or bad, so that it stops doing some of the bad stuff. Certainly we have our unconscious biases for sure, but if managed appropriately, there's so much work you can get done that gives you more time to think and plan and work with teams and grow skills. But any other questions as associated with capacity planning? Jeremy, great comments.
Yes, thank you for
we have to top
all the comments and all the questions. I'd really encourage everybody to have these conversations with your team about capacity planning, what you're doing today, how you could do it differently. Have a conversation around capacity allocation. What does the team, right? And one of my first pieces of advice I ever got in the Agile space when I became a Scrum Master was three most important questions, three words that I'll give you that you should always keep with me. This is my Scrum Mastering mentor said, whenever you're in doubt, just quote, ask the team. So sit down with your teams, talk to them about capacity planning, sit down with your teams, talk about capacity allocation policies and what they feel their capacity allocation should be as a team.
Excellent. All right. Well, folks, Todd, first off, fantastic job. And I have to say, I think my shirt is more bright and pretty than your shirt, don't you think? I wonder I wondered why. I didn't even think about why I wore this thing, and I realized it's probably screwing up people's cameras. All right, folks, we really appreciate Todd. You did a phenomenal job, man. Great job working the questions. Great information. Thank you so much. And everyone else, have a fantastic rest of your day. We really appreciate you. Recording and slides will be sent out. Anything else, Todd?
Nope. Thank you to everybody for attending. Thanks for the questions. Reach out to me if you have more follow-ups, questions. I think David shared my LinkedIn information, but
yes, I did.
There we go.
Talk to you later. Thank you.
Awesome.
Bye.